So welcome everyone, welcome to Turning Point, and welcome to the people who are watching online, wherever you are. My name's Naomi Crafti and I manage the workforce development area here at Turning Point. We're meeting today on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and those that may be present. I'm very excited today to introduce my friend and colleague and student, Jenny Valentish. One of the things that I love about being a teacher and working in education is that things happen like you get in the mail a book, and it's a book written by your student, or you hear about your student's achievements, and I guess I am a bit of a mother hen around that, and while not wanting to take any responsibility, or not needing to take any responsibility, it certainly makes me very proud when we have students achieving things like the writing of this book. And Jenny wrote a chapter of this book as part of her studies with us here at Turning Point, and I was honoured to supervise that work. And so I know, and that was just one chapter, so I certainly know the amount of work that has gone into the writing of Woman of Substances. I'm going to introduce Jenny, and then Jenny will spend about 10 minutes just introducing the book and telling you a little bit about what's in it and what you can look forward to if you read the book, and what spurred her on to writing this book. And then we'll have a bit of a Q&A. I've always wanted to do that. I've always wanted to be somebody who asks authors questions in writers' festivals or something, so this is probably as close as I'm ever going to get to that. And we'll also have an opportunity at the end of the session to open it up to questions from the audience. So this is just a bit about Jenny. Jenny is the former editor of Time Out Melbourne and Triple J's J-Mag, and a regular contributor to The Age, The Monthly and The Saturday Paper, for whom she has written about AOD researchers outing themselves as consumers, the logistics of updating AA, the problems faced by eating disorders and AOD clients, cross-sensitisation, and a whole range of other topics. She has a graduate certificate in alcohol and other drugs from Turning Point, and is one of the team behind AOD Media Watch, which is dedicated to the critical analysis of stories that contain misinformation or perpetuate stigma in the AOD sector. So welcome to Jenny Valentish.
Thank you. And just let me know if I'm not loud enough and I'll shout louder. That chapter I did for you actually took twice as long as any others because I had to do the references properly. It was a bit of a shock to the system. In general, I crunched 300 papers and books for this book, and the bibliography is on my website, but I didn't do the referencing system for the whole book because it would have taken another year. So the genesis of Women of Substances is, it really goes back to 2009. I was editing J-Mag, Triple J's magazine. I'd kind of stopped taking drugs by that point. I was 34, but the drinking was just wretched. It had gone from being kind of crazy to more a grinding, never-ending quagmire. So I stopped in 2009, and I actually came to Turning Point as well as AA. And Turning Point blew my mind, actually. I think it was, it was a combination of different things like active mindfulness and CBT and motivational interviewing, and I just thought, this woman's reading my mind. And later, of course, I did, the grad cert and did some of those modules where I thought, oh, okay, now I know what she's doing. But at the time, it was fantastic. And I wrote about 100,000 words in that first year of what was going on for me. None of it made it into the book because it was all very AA, and I stopped going after 18 months, and I don't really align to that so much anymore. So it would have been a really different book. My mission with Women of Substances was, I'd read every bloody addiction memoir I could get my hands on, and kind of living sober type books. And I thought, these all tend to end the same way. They end with abstinence, they end with very particular language of allergy and disease and addict and alcoholic. And I didn't want this to be that. I thought there is a space for that, absolutely. But I want to acknowledge that there's other routes as well, and there's other treatment options as well. So mine doesn't end with AA and abstinence. So obviously my background is as a journalist. My academic background is limited to getting a fairly poorly rated degree back in '96, which was my crack smoking period. So surprising I got anything. Mm-hmm. So it was quite difficult sort of putting myself out there and trying to crunch papers and meet researchers and try and nail the language. One of the first people I spoke to was actually Professor Steve Alsop. I flew to Perth to meet him because I'd interviewed him before. And he has a great overview of everything, and he really coached me on language as well, which was great to get that sorted right at the beginning. Although I did have to go through the book at the end and do a find and replace for abuse, as in substance abuse, and switch that because a few of those made it in. But yeah, so the idea was to have 3 parts. The first is predictors of, what might make someone turn to alcohol and drugs at a later age. The middle section is a very gendered look at what are women's issues in particular. And then the final section is about treatment. So I'm going to read you a pretty heavy bit, because I wouldn't normally read it, so it's like, I can read it today. Mm-hmm. And it even starts with a sentence that my publisher begged me not to put in. So here we go. I thought I'd read it because it might be familiar to you all. Back in 1993, the turd on the tube seat was an excellent find. Whoever had deposited it had since departed the London Underground, but they'd done me a massive favour. It was an act of public aggression, and I was claiming it. By now, I lived in London at one end of the Piccadilly line. When I got on the tube, the carriage would be reasonably empty, but with each stop, it would fill up. Taking the seat opposite a freshly laid log would spare me the stress of human company. Sure enough, every commuter made a beeline for the free seat, recoiled, looked at me, and retreated. Thank you, mysterious stranger. I wasn't dealing well with this was I or was I not raped stuff. I'd stopped drinking for 5 weeks, seizing the incident as the chance to turn my life around. But I was 18. A life without alcohol would be no life at all. So I started drinking again, and with that came a fatalistic acceptance. I knew my level of consumption made it impossible to stay safe, yet I had made my choice. So I wouldn't be able to cry victim again, not even to myself. Speed, I reasoned, ought to keep me from passing out and then being unsafe. But somewhere along the way, there had been a tipping point. The euphoric element had switched from making me feel empathetic and enigmatic to paranoid and grandiose. Associate Professor Nicole Lee from the National Drug Research Institute explains that at low doses, stimulants such as speed, meth, coke, enhance the mood. They increase dopamine, making you feel a lot more confident and focused. Your memory improves, and because of the increased serotonin, there's more optimism. If you're feeling vulnerable, stimulants will make you feel more confident. If you've got mental health symptoms making your head a bit fuzzy, they'll improve that as well. But that's only at low doses. When people become dependent, they tend to use stimulants to ward off withdrawal symptoms, and the benefits they were seeking disappear. Lee says, they experience more of the negative symptoms they're trying to get rid of. Paranoia and hypervigilance might increase, as would depression. For some people, their confidence could increase until they feel like Superwoman, but in reality, they're quite manic with an element of being delusional. For me, London became a city of 8 million adversaries. I prowled the platforms like Travis Bickle, lodging every psst, every deliberate swerve into my path, every man who sat in the carriage with his legs spread, moving his hand around by his crotch to draw a glance. My hypervigilance wasn't helped by the fact that I'd been in a fiery car crash earlier that year with some random young drunks I'd met down the pub. The crashing of branches and crackling of flames invaded my dreams, and by day I was alert for imminent disaster. I'd walk under scaffolding and picture it toppling down on top of me, or imagine a knife in my back or being shoved under the tube train. My paranoia became a persecution complex. Even the cars and hedgerows were looking at me funny. So I was drawing attention to myself. What man wouldn't look twice at a weird girl vibrating with rage as we waited 3 minutes for the next train? I became combative, outstaring my adversaries, violently slamming my limbs around as I took a seat, alarming anyone lost in their own little world. Half the time I was deliberately seeking out soft targets, closing in on commuters who were simply minding their own business and lurking right behind them. Once in my seat, I ostentatiously read Valerie Solanas' Scum Manifesto. I'm not naturally that antisocial. My default setting is one of very British politeness, of waiting to get home to eat a cold pie rather than eat a hot one on the train and risk causing my fellow passengers discomfort or envy, and of crossing to the other side of the street when walking behind someone at night so as not to make them alarmed. But amphetamines and anger are a particularly toxic combination. Right then, the tip of power in my favour felt good, and the bag of speed zipped into the sleeve of my bomber jacket became a weapon in my psychic warfare. Speeding off my tits served two purposes. I would look mad and unapproachable, and I might become bold enough to take a swing at someone should the situation call for it. Anyway, I had bought a flick knife in a dodgy shop in Hounslow and cradled it in the palm of one hand. Feeling as though I was on the outskirts of society brought with it a sense of freedom. From now on, it was shoot first, ask questions later. So yeah, that was not a good year. And, it's kind of hard to relate to now because it was more than half a lifetime ago. But yeah, there's the whole gamut in here from that kind of period to being a lot older and actually actively wanting help.
So there's an awful lot in this book. And obviously in the time that we've got available today, we're never going to be able to cover even half the questions I could ask just about those 2 pages, let alone the rest of the book. The good news for those of you who want to hear Jenny talk some more after today is that she's done a lot of radio and press, or mostly radio, I think, in the last few months since the book was published, so you can access quite a lot of material online. I listened recently to an interview that Jenny did with Richard Feidler for the ABC, which I thought was really excellent. So if you want to hear Jenny talking about other aspects of the book, then please do a search and get online and have a listen. What we chose to talk about today, which is something that particularly interests me both before and since meeting Jenny, and the whole idea of working with people with a lived experience, both in a mental health setting previously and here at Turning Point, is this whole idea of writing about lived experience. The notion of putting yourself out there, of writing a book like this, the process involved, the impact that it has on the writer, the impact it has on the reader, and so on. So we're going to focus, at least to start with, about the process perhaps more so than the content. And then, as I said, we'll have an opportunity to talk about some other things after that. So, Jenny, this particular book is really interesting, as you mentioned in your introduction, because it's not just a memoir. It's a combination of a memoir about your substance use, but also as a journalist, your gathering of information and dissemination of information about AOD use. So can you tell us a bit about how you decided to do that type of book?
Yeah, it was quite nerve-wracking not having a supervisor, because the research element was basically I'd have to start from scratch, and literally, probably shouldn't admit this, but literally I was Googling things like comorbid eating disorder, substance use, professor, and finding sources like that. And then, I'd have to go and meet someone and admit that I am the main case study in this book, which is really awkward. I would never ask questions relating to myself directly, because I think that would put someone in an awkward position. But, talk about imposter syndrome, going to somebody who's worked in the field for 20 years and saying, can I mine your knowledge on this subject, because I'm going to put it in a book about the whole thing. In a way, though, I think not having an academic background or working in the field was an advantage, because I didn't feel like I had to stay in my lane. I did my best with the language, but I wasn't so confined with it that I was sort of policing myself and answerable to department heads and whatnot. But yeah, I basically went to every alcohol and drug conference last year that I could afford, and absorbed everything and made note of who to contact afterwards. And like I say, people would then recommend others, and it became this rolling ball that made me feel more and more confident as we went on. But it was a bit like trying to create this Frankenstein's monster. Well, not trying to create a Frankenstein monster, but in my attempt to make a bigger picture from everyone's expertise, I was worried that I was creating a Frankenstein's monster, because it was like going in with no eyes and feeling your way around. I was trusting that I was getting that I was on the right track, and that I was pulling on the right things. Like there's a chapter on impulsivity, there's a chapter on childhood temperament, there's a chapter on comorbid eating disorders, and I feel confident, having finished it, that my choices were correct, but there could have been other things too, and I could have maybe created a very skewed monster. But the feedback from people is not that. The feedback is that it's a really useful resource for people in the field too, which is the ultimate compliment, really.
Those of us who work in the AOD and mental health sectors, we talk about the value of listening to people's lived experiences, but we often sort of there's a cautionary note there that you have to wait till the right time for somebody to be able to talk about their lived experience, and you want somebody to be at the right stage in recovery in order to do that. So when is the right time to come out and write a book like this?
Having written it, I even wonder, was this too early? Because, it's kind of triggered a lot of things. But before I started it, I felt very stable and on an even keel, and like I had a pretty good sort of grasp of why things had happened to me. I'd done a lot of sort of therapy, I'd come here. After quitting drinking, it took a couple of years to sort of discover who I was. So in that first 2 years would have been a disaster. Also, it would have been a very disease-orientated book at that point, very AA, which, while I acknowledge that in the finished thing, I do say at the beginning that I align with the biopsychosocial kind of model. So it would have been very different. So I think people need to kind of wait till their life has absolutely reached some kind of equilibrium again, and they feel a strong sense of identity. That's really important. Just this week, you mentioned AOD Media Watch earlier, that I'm a member of. It's a core team of sort of clinicians, ex-law enforcement, and researchers. And there was a story that came out about a private clinic that the ABC had gone along there and done these big photo portraits of them and named them the full names. And it was, the usual narrative of this person's an addict. Here's their struggle. It's so bad. What are the worst things that have happened to you? How hard is your life right now? And these are people who've been there for 2 weeks. They might want to go back out and keep using for the rest of their lives apart from anything else. Or they might just feel very differently about what sobriety looks like, as I do now, compared to the first 2 weeks. So I definitely think as much time that can pass as possible probably is wise.
But there's still a freshness and a reality to the way you write as well. So, you know, you can't have so much time pass that you've forgotten
Yeah.
what it was like to be in there.
Yeah, and that's true because I wrote it, but by the time I finished drinking and taking drugs when I was 34, I was very, like I say, eager for help. If I look back to my teens and 20s, I was in no position to be helped, really. And so I've got to remember that when I'm promoting it. You know, it's all very well for me to say, yeah, just see as many professional services as you can and read up, but not everyone's in that mindset yet, and nor was I when I was younger.
We're going to come to that. We've got a question about that a bit later. But before we come to that question, it's almost as if you were your own therapist in writing this book, because you switch from, you know, the first person and your discussion of your own, as you say, yourself as a case study, and then you talk about the experience of the professionals or the professional stance. So how did you go about logistically writing that in that way?
That was really difficult, actually, wearing two hats, hat of journalist and hat of person with lived experience. As a journalist, you want to be really responsible, have a duty of care to the reader, who I anticipate is someone struggling or their family. So there's certain things it's not helpful to say, but they're the things that, as the person who's lived that, they're the things that you feel. So, for instance, there's a chapter alluded to in that reading where I was raped. And that was really difficult. I left it right to the end because I wanted to describe my sort of grey area around the topic and how difficult that made the whole thing. But I wanted to be responsible to the reader and not make it sound like there is a grey area. So finding the balance was incredibly tricky. And you want to be true to that person who's feeling these strong emotions, because that's the narrator that people are going to relate to. But then look after the reader. Very difficult.
Yeah. So how successful do you
Dunno.
think you were?
I mean, obviously I've got a publisher stroke editor who reads the finished thing, and this isn't her field of expertise, but there are certain things she pulled me into line for, saying, I think this would be irresponsible, wind that back a bit, that kind of thing.
Okay. So I think that does lead us to this question, because we all know that when we write or talk about things like suicide or eating disorders, we often do that being very cognizant of the fact that the discussion could be triggering of some people, that we need to be very careful. And of course there are guidelines in the media about talking about those issues and needing to put warnings and giving people information about where to get help. But we tend not to do that when we talk about alcohol and other drugs. So Jenny and I had a little discussion about this, and I was saying it was real. As I was reading the book, I was trying to take off my middle-aged, boring woman's hat and try and think of myself, you know, what it might be like for a young person, 15, 16 years of age, just starting in life, starting to experiment with drug taking, and thinking about the 16-year-old Jenny and her experiences, and just wondering, what would 16-year-old Jenny think about reading this book, and is there an issue about writing these sorts of things that they could perhaps, rather than being a cautionary tale, could be seen as something to be attractive and sort of motivating in the wrong direction?
I think 16-year-old Jenny would think this is somebody who knows what I'm going through. This is a narrator that can be trusted. There's probably one paragraph in there which describes speed as being pretty wonderful, and then all the rest is very negative. There's a lot of consequence in this book. It's cause, effect, consequence. So I do remember reading and poring over Go Ask Alice when I was younger by Anonymous. It's actually by a Mormon counsellor called Beatrice Sparks, who then wrote a follow-up about a teenage boy who got into the occult and killed himself, allegedly. So this was her thing. And I remember poring over that because it was like reading about a sweet shop. But the thing is, the way it was written, was the person was still a youth. It was somebody who was gaining independence, hanging out with exciting people. I don't think I've done that. Everyone I hung out with was a scumbag. That's not fair. But, you know, it's not painted in a great light. It's painted very grindingly. And because we talked about this, I did find a review of my book which says, all anecdotes about Valentish's life are related back to broader discussions, and her own behaviour is examined in critical detail rather than exalted. Couldn't have written that better myself. So it doesn't glamorise anything. There's loads of helplines in the back. I noticed Jimmy Barnes, his memoir, which has an awful lot of drinking in it, he's got tons of helplines in the back. I think eating disorders are different because it's very sort of numbers orientated. So people are scrutinising copy for how many laxatives did someone take, how much weight did they lose. It's about thinspo, you know. It's not. I don't think drug use is quite the same. And in any case, I think people could find a more inspiring book than mine. Like I used to gobble up Hunter S. Thompson and read about his drug-fueled exploits, but they were fun. Kat Marnell was a beauty editor in New York. She wrote How to Murder Your Life, a memoir, came out at Christmas. That's a bit different. I think that could possibly fall into the category that you're talking about. She's still actively using a lot. She has these incredibly glamorous jobs. So while things don't go great for her, there's kind of a balance there. There is an audiobook version of my book, and the cover I didn't really have much of a say in, and it's like lines of coke, a cigarette in an ashtray, paraphernalia generally. That's a bit different. I think that could be interpreted as tempting. But in general, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what people think, but I think this is a different category to eating disorders and how careful we have to be there.
Mm. Yeah, interested to hear response from the audience after about that. So just thinking about yourself, you know, obviously years down the track from the 16, 17-year-old Jenny, writing about these experiences, did you find them triggering in any way, and how did you look after yourself during the writing process?
I didn't find them triggering in terms of wanting to use or drink. I did smoke all the way through it quite heavily, and I wasn't smoking before. So there were coping mechanisms in place. The problem was I had to write 2 chapters a month. I didn't have time to see any friends, like isolated. I've got a really supportive husband, but if you're writing a book, any kind of book, you're holding this universe in your head. You can't really explain it to people. So it's very isolating. Didn't have time for any exercise. Everything that you could possibly do wrong in terms of not looking after yourself, I did, because I didn't have time. And so
you were focused, I guess, on that.
I was focused, particularly because I was also taking modafinil, which I'd just been prescribed, which makes you want to smoke, and it makes you anxious, and then you can't sleep properly. So it was all a bit of a nightmare, actually. And then at the end, you know, I'd had all this kind of behaviour which was everything but drinking, which I thought was good. And then in the end, I'd handed in the final manuscript. I went to England and I drank unexpectedly. And I had to say, can I have the manuscript back? And I added that at the end. And I thought that's fine, because in the final chapter anyway, I talked about the fact that since quitting drinking, I've occasionally taken substances, which was a bit of a risky thing to say, but I wanted to put it out there to demonstrate that, you know, sobriety or whatever you want to call it can look different for everyone. So at the end now, it admits that I drank at Christmas, and then it's become a good sort of talking point, really. But I'm not surprised now that I drank. I can see now that these behaviours weren't instead of, they were leading to.
In the final chapter of the book, you discuss the fact that sobriety is not one size fits all, and you admit, as you just did then, to occasional substance use. So why did you do that? I mean, you've explained sort of why you ended up writing that, but why do you think that's important to you to have done that?
Firstly, if you're going to be honest all the way through a book, to sort of fudge the last chapter would be weird. But I was trying to drive home the fact that it's quite unusual for people to be completely absent of the rest of their lives statistically. And so it's not just my own example that I give. I talk about Professor Mark Lewis, who I'd interviewed for the book, saying he gave up heroin, but he still uses alcohol. I'm not promoting that as an idea, but I'm saying, by the way, it doesn't have to look like all or nothing, because I think that could actually, one, look a bit condemning of people who carry on but are trying to cut down. And two, maybe even put off people who are really struggling but can't envisage a life of completely giving everything up. So, it was basically aligning to our harm minimization framework, and for that reason I can't imagine it ever selling in the States. I know Professor Mark Lewis, when he wrote The Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease, before it even came out, people were going on Amazon giving him 1 out of 5. Because it's upsetting if you have aligned to a certain kind of paradigm that has, in your opinion, saved your life. So the book's coming out in the UK, which is a bit more in line with us, but unlikely to come out anywhere where the war of drugs is even more hardline.
When Jenny and I spoke before she'd written the book, or I guess it was during, at the time that I first met you, we talked quite a lot about the gendered perspective, and Jenny has a lot to say in the book about women and about women and substance use specifically, and there are lots of reasons that I would suggest that you might want to read this book, but that's certainly one that was most attractive to me. So you identify some media tropes of women who use substances. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. The media seems to reliably have women who use drugs fall into these categories. There's the party girl who, if somebody has overdosed on a pill, it will always be the first time they ever took a pill. They'll be hopefully blonde, fetishized on the front page. Steve Alsop called it open casket coverage. But there'll be references to her appearance throughout, and it's kind of like the innocent, your child, who, this one time that somebody gave them something to try, this is what happens. Then there's kind of the disgraced middle classer, which is, I think Harriet Rand would fall into that category, but there's a real crowing aspect to this one, hopefully it's the daughter of somebody quite prominent, or there's just this attitude of, oh, how the mighty have fallen, kind of thing. You get the slovenly mum, who is a dumping ground for disgust, If you ever have like a couple who have been involved in some crime or neglect or something, it will always be the mum's Facebook page where they take the photos from. So other than the fallen starlet as well, I would say those are the main three. I don't know which one am I. I think I'm the disgraced middle classer.
So since the book came out, as I said, there's been quite a lot of media interest and a lot written about the book. I guess the question I've got is two parts. I mean, how was the feedback that you got what you expected, and how do you deal with it?
I am a catastrophist, so I expected it to be far worse than it was. Nobody's been outright aggressive or judgmental. It was difficult though, because I really wanted to normalise conversation around 3 areas. Child sex abuse, when I say normalise, I mean talk about it in a really normal conversational way. Like, this is a normal thing to talk about. So child sex abuse, addiction, and then relapse, or whatever you want to call it. Because it's kind of seen like this, I don't know, an axe that comes from above and everything's going to be over if it falls. So that was the mission, and I came out of the gates really fresh, and I had some really stupid questions, and I handled them really well, I think. It got to sort of week 3, week 4, and it was having a real kind of a war of attrition effect. So, I often just get asked, they're trying to sort of push you into that reductive stereotype of how bad was it? What was it like the first time you got drunk? Everyone's had a first time of getting drunk. Why waste everyone's time? I've done all this research. What was it like when you stopped? So what was it like when you started? What was it like when you stopped? Waste of time. So by the time I got to week 3, and you know, it's fine if somebody meets you halfway and they're engaged. It's really dependent on who's interviewing you. If you think sometimes they might have a word with you beforehand and confess to having a bit of a struggle, or somebody close to them has, or you just know that they get it. Then it's really easy if you get a question about being sexually abused as a kid, which I kind of expect is in the beginning of the book. But if you don't have that kind of rapport, and you know, you might be sitting in the TARDIS at the ABC and there's nobody even there, and you just get producers' questions in your ear, or someone just asking something in a non-engaged way, that personal, it's incredibly difficult because every fibre of your body your instinct is going, don't. Like, you would never have this conversation with this person in real life, but you got to, so you just hear yourself saying the words, and it just takes a little bit of you every time. And it also kind of starts to erase your boundaries, because you've talked about really personal stuff, which means you've given people license to ask you really personal questions. And so you just have to kind of take it and have your boundaries intruded upon all the time. So there's been a couple of interviews where I've just kind of spat the dummy, and luckily, just by coincidence, they were pre-records and not live. And I had this wonderful publicist who had an amazing duty of care, which is, you know, you can't guarantee you're going to get that. And she made a few things go away. Other times things went really, really well, like you mentioned Richard Feidler, and this is a great example because the week before an interview, one of his producers, he's got 2, will call you and spend an hour on the phone going through the sort of things that you're comfortable with saying, but at the same time making it clear that this has got to be really personal, this is what he does. And then you get there and you get like a pot of tea and everyone's really nice, and it's a very different experience to when you normally go into a radio station. You're like sort of pushed into the seat, and then if it's a phone you're hung up on, and if you're actually in the studio then it's like so it makes a world of difference. And the press has shown no sign of stopping. I did an interview at 10 o'clock last night, got a few coming up in the week, and I just have to like take loads of baths and do my research and try and figure out, listen to their show, try and figure out what they're likely to ask me, come up with some deflection tactics if need be.
Yeah, so you put the phone down after an interview. What do you do?
I might complain to someone. You know, just a friend. Yeah, it's not like, oh,
debrief.
God!
So you might debrief a bit.
Yeah. I actually, it's my old AA friends who I always talk to whenever I've got a problem. As a group of us all started at the same time. I left in 2011, but having that, it was really useful when I did attend, and having that cohort still there to talk to during this is really invaluable.
So just one more question before we hand it over to the audience. So you mentioned that women who are, you know, going through a difficult time and perhaps using substances are your sort of main, the main sort of readers that you have in mind. Can you give us some examples of some of the comments that you've had from readers?
And I wouldn't give specific examples, but it tends to be people obviously sharing their stories. And if I do an event like a launch for a writers' festival, it can turn into a bit of an AA share session. I think that's the case when people talk about addiction across the board. So definitely it's a two-way street. I'm hearing lots of stories. Even friends of mine are coming to me and telling me about stuff I had no idea about. And as I say, I might go on the radio and beforehand somebody might disclose information. So it's having this effect of allowing people to speak openly, and I have been told by a few people that they appreciate the fact that I talk about things like addiction and child abuse in a completely normal voice, usually. because they haven't heard it talked about that way before.
So how do you deal with being the repository of all those?
Yeah, well, I've had to
Stories.
establish boundaries there. I don't have a supervisor, as we've established, so I can't even sort of offload to someone and go, what would you do in this scenario? So if it seems as though somebody's becoming sort of dependent on me or projecting onto me or whatever, I have to sort of pull back a bit. It's awkward. And I have to explain, look, I'm not a professional, I'm not qualified to give you any advice whatsoever, apart from see a professional.
So let's turn it over to you guys. Have you got questions for Jenny? Yeah.
First of all, a comment. Just thanks for finding back your editor to keep that first section. It was fantastic. And secondly, what was it? You may have touched on this, but was it a therapeutic process for you writing this?
As I was writing it, because I'm a bit of an overthinker, I was creating this document of things you can say in interviews, which got to about 20 pages, so it's just useless. But I was particularly anticipating the question of, is it cathartic? And I was thinking, no, it's the opposite of cathartic. It's traumatic. But I hadn't finished at that point. And so when I actually finished it and I got the book back, this feeling of liberation was immense. I felt really free from it all. Obviously the press hadn't started at that point. So there was like this window of about 2 months where it was like, this feels amazing, I'm completely unburdened. And then it comes to talking about it for the rest of your life. But it was really therapeutic. I didn't have time to see an actual therapist when I was writing it. But as soon as I finished, I started seeing an addiction counsellor, because obviously it does sort of, it may be therapeutic, but at the same time it does churn stuff up as well.
Any other questions?
So where to from here? I mean, you talk a lot about your experience and what you've been through, but where do you see yourself in the next year, 5 years?
Yeah.
What comes next?
I am talking to a drug and alcohol sort of research arm at the moment about doing a PhD, possibly. And it would be, what the book kind of ties in with their work, happily. And so they contacted me just to sort of say hello and this is great. And I came up with something that could possibly fit into their future sort of canon of work. So I'm thinking about that at the moment. I did sort of idly consider Men of Substances, but I don't think a man would read it if it was written by a woman. It would be interesting for me, but I think I'm the wrong person to do it. I'm very interested in the adolescent kind of age, though, and substance use at that point.
Do you think you'll get a movie out of the book?
I can't see how they'd structure it, really.
It.
Yeah. Also, it doesn't end with sort of outright redemption like most addiction memoirs. It ends up with me going, yeah, well, life's subject to change. Yeah.
Who would you like to play you,
I
Jenny?
don't know. No idea.
You may have already said, and I haven't heard, but so do you class yourself as sober or abstinent or any of those things?
No. So the way I phrase it is I quit drinking in 2009.
Yeah.
And I actually list a few examples of things I've taken since then in the book.
Yeah. Because you mentioned you were taking modafinil while you were writing it.
Well, that was prescribed.
Oh, so that's okay.
Well, according to me it is, yeah.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
But the examples I give in the back of the book aren't that.
Yeah.
They're like illicit. They're not even illicit. They're just things that maybe I'm misusing.
Yeah. Thank you.
What do you think we're missing in our treatment of women with substance use problems?
Well, I think everyone in this room probably knows that it would be not having enough sort of trauma-focused care. And that goes from when you go and see a GP, having this sort of thing, having their radar go up, to seeing a mental health service, to seeing a drug and alcohol service. I hear stories of people going to rehabs and being asked, well, you have to talk about the rape you just told me about in front of the mixed group or get out, because that's the way it works. So I think gender sensitive care, a focus on trauma. Definitely when I was younger and really, really, really struggling, at one point I was going to the GP every 2 weeks because I didn't know what was wrong with me. Like I had amphetamine psychosis, but I didn't know. And I'd get sent away having been told how to breathe in and out of a paper bag. And maybe at that point things could have been nipped in the bud if, instead of this guy kind of sighing every time I came in every 2 weeks, he would refer me to a psychologist or ask some pertinent questions himself. There was nothing about how you're sleeping, what you're eating. Eventually he asked if I was taking drugs, but nothing about what the underlying cause might be. And it's not about the drug. You can take away the drug, the problem's still going to be there, as we know.
What do you do for self-care now?
Yeah, I see an addiction psychologist every month, and I go to SMART, where I live, and that's been great. I've only been to 2 so far, but I intend to keep going, and it's very much aligned with how I feel about how flexible your life can look.
Can I ask a question? When you look at your life and you think about your addiction, and it sounds like you've been through a lot and recognised a lot and worked through a lot, would you change
it? This changes the answer to that question. So now that I've written this, no, I wouldn't change it, because it's actually brought me much closer with my family, which was an unexpected outcome. I expected the opposite. Like I said, it's made sense of everything. It's a helpful resource for other people. It's made it all worthwhile. Had there not been that conclusion, I would change. There was particularly about 10 years where I wouldn't even allow myself to look back on ever, which I had to mine for this. So I would get rid of that 10 years for a start. I don't know if it was that useful, really,
Given periods of drug addiction can be a real blur with your memory and stuff, how did you go about, just on a practical level, remembering when things happen, what age things happen, and having that in your mind? What sort of research did you need to do?
That's where music comes in to me. I can remember, music ties things together. I could remember, if you name a song, pretty much tell the year, and that's my sort of marker of time. Also, I have my medical records. When I left England, whenever you move doctor, your records get sent from place to place, and you can just ask for them. And so it was all there. It was quite shocking, falls, head injuries, amphetamine psychosis. So that was a great marker of time as well. I do say in the book I'm not the most reliable narrator, but definitely it's pretty much right.
So I'd just like to end by encouraging everybody to read Jenny's book. It's a really good read. She writes beautifully. But it is also, I think that combination of case study, lived experience, and tying that in with the research and speaking to professionals in the field, I think makes it quite unique in the genre. So I think it's definitely worth reading. And I've just got a final question to ask you, Jenny, because we talked about what the 16-year-old Jenny or 17-year-old Jenny might think about reading this book. What would you say now to the 16-year-old Jenny if she was sitting in front of you?
Really should have thought of an answer to this. I would try and encourage that person to look beyond themselves. You know, I was very self-absorbed, and I thought my problems were worse than everybody else's. So, you know, when you start to do things for other people, you check in on other people. You don't ring people to, you check in on them, and you do volunteer work, and you empathise and put yourself in other people's shoes. I don't think I did that at all. So I think that would be
like
a useful
most
skill.
16-year-olds.
16 to 34.
Yeah.
So that would be a good start, and go and seek help, because I didn't feel you could. I thought your problems had to be far worse. It was definitely discouraged in my family, that kind of thing. And I think things could have been shortened had I done that. I didn't do it till I was like 30.
So Jenny Valentish, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.